The History of Japan, a story of rebuilding. Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today's story is not about one person. It is about an entire nation, Japan, and the pattern that repeats again and again across its 2,000-year history, destruction and then rebuilding. Wars, invasions, earthquakes, isolation, and even the atomic bomb tried to end Japan's story more than once. Every time, the same thing happened. Japan did not disappear. It rebuilt, often stronger and more disciplined than before. This story matters because most people think history is about dates and kings. It is actually about a much simpler question. What do people do after everything falls apart? Watch till the end, and if you are learning English, listen carefully, repeat the useful sentences, and practice with this meaningful lesson. If stories about resilience and rebuilding inspire you, subscribe to this channel. Let's begin. Part 1. Before the Emperors. Long before Japan had emperors, samurai, or shoguns, it had the Jomon people, hunter-gatherers, who lived on the islands for thousands of years, making some of the oldest pottery ever discovered in the world. Slowly, farming arrived from the Asian mainland, bringing rice cultivation and permanent villages. Small settlements grew into fortified communities, and over centuries, powerful clans emerged to compete for land and control. By the 8th century, one clan, the Yamato, had risen above the rest, forming Japan's first unified imperial dynasty. In 794, Emperor Kamu moved the capital to a new city, Heian-kyo, known today as Kyoto. This began the Heian period, an age of extraordinary cultural achievement. It was here that Japan developed its own writing systems, hiragana and katakana, and here that a court lady named Murasaki Shikibu wrote The Tale of Genji, considered one of the world's first novels. But peace inside the palace did not mean peace across the land. Outside the capital, powerful regional warriors were quietly gaining strength. Warriors who would soon change Japan forever. Part 2. The Age of the Sword. By the 12th century, real power had shifted away from the emperors, court, and into the hands of a new ruling class, the samurai. Military governments called shogunates took control, while the emperor remained in Kyoto as a symbolic figure with little actual authority. This was an era defined by conflict. In 1274, and again a few years later, Mongol invasion fleets sent by Kublai Khan attempted to conquer Japan, and both times, typhoons destroyed much of the invading navy before it could succeed. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, meaning divine wind, a term that would resurface centuries later in a very different context. Internal conflict was just as fierce. In 1467, a devastating civil war known as the Onin War broke out between rival shoguns and regional warlords called daimyo, plunging the country into more than a century of near-constant warfare, a period historians call the Sengoku, or Warring States era. Japan was fractured, its regions ruled by competing armies rather than a single government. Then, across the late 1500s, three powerful leaders, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and finally, Tokugawa Ieyasu, gradually reunified the country through a mix of military conquest and political strategy. In 1603, Tokugawa established his shogunate in a city called Edo, the city we now know as Tokyo, beginning one of the most stable and most closed-off periods in Japanese history. Part 3. 2 centuries behind a locked door. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan made a deliberate choice. Isolation. Foreign trade was almost entirely cut off. Foreign travel was forbidden, and Christianity, introduced earlier by Portuguese missionaries, was suppressed. For over 200 years, Japan closed its doors to most of the outside world. Inside that closed door, something remarkable happened. Rather than stagnating, Japanese culture flourished. Edo grew into one of the largest cities on earth. With a population exceeding 1 million, people by the early 1700s, larger than London or Paris at the time, art, theater, literature, and craftsmanship reached extraordinary heights during what became known as the Genroku era. But isolation could not last forever. In 1853, an American naval commander named Matthew Perry arrived with a fleet of warships and forced Japan to open its ports to foreign trade. The shock of this encounter, a country suddenly confronted with how far behind it had fallen in military and industrial technology, triggered one of the most dramatic transformations any nation has ever undergone. Part 4. Rebuilding from zero twice. In 1868, the shogunate collapsed, and Emperor Meiji took the throne in what became known as the Meiji Restoration. Japan made a startling decision. Instead of resisting Western technology, it would study it, adopt it, and master it faster than anyone expected. Within a few decades, Japan built modern industries, a modern military, and modern institutions, transforming from an isolated feudal society into a major world power in barely one generation. That rapid rise eventually led Japan into some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century, culminating in the Second World War. By August 1945, atomic bombs had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan's cities lay in ruins. For the second time in less than 100 years, the country faced a question that could have ended any nation. What do you do when almost everything is destroyed? Japan rebuilt again. Within 2 decades, its economy had recovered so completely that by 1964, Tokyo was hosting the Olympic Games, a symbolic announcement to the world that Japan had returned, not as it was before, but transformed once more. Look closely at this pattern across 2,000 years. Invasions, survived by storms and strategy. 2 centuries of isolation turned into cultural richness. A feudal nation rebuilt into an industrial power in 1 generation, and a devastated post-war country rebuilt again into an economic power within a few decades. Japan's history is not really a story about avoiding destruction. It is a story about what people choose to do afterward. The lesson is simple, and it applies far beyond one country. Being knocked down is not the end of a story. It is often just the chapter before the rebuilding begins, and how seriously you take that rebuilding decides everything that comes next. If this story gave you a new way to think about resilience, subscribe to this channel for more honest, fact-based stories like this one. See you in the next story.